All right, so once again, this is Kevin Hareholtz over at Attorney Technologies. I'd like to welcome you to today's guest speaker session, Work Hacks for Business Success, Building Employee Trust in the Workplace. And, of course, we have a very special guest speaker with us today, Peter DeMarco. Before we go ahead and talk about Peter and his background and get ready for this great presentation, ResponseWare is where you're going to be able to go today to have it completely interactive. In other words, we want you to be able to answer questions throughout Peter's presentation, and you can do that by going to responseware.com either in a separate browser, or you can pick up your smartphone to go ahead and make your way over to that URL. Now, once you're there, it's going to ask you for a session ID, and that session ID is simply just going to be trust. It will ask for a first and last name, but by no means you have to input that. You can just go ahead and click submit to join that session. All right, so with no further ado, with us today we have Peter DeMarco. Now, Peter is a West Point graduate. He has extensive leadership experience in general management and executive assignments in the U.S. and Mexico. He has logged 14,000 hours in executive coaching and delivering leadership development programs to businesses and nonprofit organizations. Peter received the distinction of being top thought leader in the year 2014 and 2015 by Trust Across America, Trust Around the World, and was recently invited to be the guest on the Tucker Carlson Tonight's cable news program. So, Peter, as always, it's very, very special to have you with us today. And, Peter, in just a moment, I'm going to give you the ability to share your screen. So, everybody go ahead and hang tight as we're transitioning control of the webinar over to Peter. And, Peter, at this time, you now have the ability to share your screen. So, Peter, welcome aboard here.
Thank you, Kevin. Greetings, everyone. I'm going to put this into presentation mode. And how's that look, Kevin?
Looks great, Peter. We can see you full screen. We're set, ready to go.
All right, folks. As we get going today, if any of you have questions we don't answer, please note my email address, pdemarco@prioritythinking.com. Send them my way after the presentation. We'll be glad to do our best to have me or members of my team respond. All right, let's get started. We have a five-part presentation for you today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about priority thinking. Second, we're going to do some interactive polling using Turning Point. We'll have demographics and questions. And, of course, for those of you familiar with the technology, we'll be slicing some of your responses according to the demographics. Then we're going to get into what is trust. It's a word we use often and not always understand as completely as we should. And we'll show you how to apply our concepts of trust to help you build trust where you work. Next, have a little bit of fun with how do you tend to trust others, and a little play on words there, extending trust as well. And we'll show you a little model we have that might help you see the different ways that trust is extended and how to build it up, maintain it, and restore it when an apology is necessary. And then finally, avoiding trust traps. We've all had them. We've all fallen into them. We'll have a little bit of discussion about it. Time permitting, I'll take you through some of the tools. All right, so here are the takeaways from today. First, I'd like you to think about who, what, and how we trust is going to determine both whether we survive, especially in dangerous times, and whether we thrive as we pursue happiness. Second, where does trust occur? In the faculty powers we have within our character, like the memory, imagination, intellect, will, emotions, even our exterior sense faculties of sight, hearing, taste, etc. Trust is actually occurring in a particular location, and I'm going to discuss that according to our model and invite any of your questions. Next, third, decision to trust. It's always going to involve some level of risk, because if you're trusting, it means you're not completely sure. So keep that in mind. Then I'm going to introduce you to the healthiest way that people tend to trust. So I'm going to give you four options. I'm going to ask you a question about how you trust, or you tend to trust, and then how others tend to trust you, and we'll look at the differences. Time permitting, I'll take you through 5 ways to avoid trust traps. And then finally, restoring trust always requires us to understand the meaning of an authentic apology. And so, time permitting, I'll take you through some of the 2 false apologies, and in fact, I'll tell to you up front. The first one being to apologize for the way somebody feels. In other words, you're not apologizing for what was actually done. And then second, apologizing because you made a mistake instead of just taking ownership of the action that you did. So a mistake, for example, is making a left turn when you intended to make a right turn. Those are unintentional. So keep those in mind. Those are the takeaways. I'll review those at the end. All right, a little bit about priority thinking. We've been around since 2003, but I actually discovered this framework in 1993 when I was running Ray-Ban sunglass operation in the U.S. and eventually went off on my own after I'd made it up into the C-level ranks. We're a full-time coaching and consulting practice, and that's a little bit on our background there. Next, I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. Our mission is to help leaders, employees, and teams to recognize, learn, practice, and keep sound priorities. Three major areas: leadership, coaching, and development. A lot of leadership programs that we put on includes the MBA in the MBA space. Organizational development, which extends out from our leadership programs. And then we are ethics educators, so the whole model is completely integrated. My first book, it will be launching at the end of the year, early 2018, called The Goodwill Leader. And these concepts you're hearing about today, some of those concepts are in the book. And finally, our value proposition, or what we deliver to our clients, is increased performance, reduced risk, and embedding natural ethical power. And trust is obviously a key element of that. So just a little bit about us. I'd like to tell you about our history with Turning Technologies. We've been with them since 2007. Frankly, I could not have unpacked our model without this technology. Today we have over 1,100 devices. We like to think of ourselves as power users. We're always using the various interactive polling technologies, and Kevin and his colleagues are hearing from us when we want to see improvements or changes. So we think it's a great tool for adult learning, and it's a huge differentiator in how we deliver our programs and content. So let's get started with a few polling questions. I'm going to open up with the first demographic around gender. So press 1 for female, 2 for male, and 3 for other.
And once again, everybody, to join the session, we want you to make your way to responseware.com. Once you're on the Responseware website, put in that session ID trust, and then it will ask for a first and last name. By no means are these required fields. You can bypass that, and you'll be set or ready to answer the question. So once again, it's responseware.com, session ID trust.
And Kevin, let me know when you think the count gets up high enough, and we'll start to go through these questions faster. Also, folks, if you do have a question, send it along to Kevin, and during the polling, I'll do my best to answer as folks are responding to the questions.
Yeah, Peter, let's see. We're looking pretty decent. We got about half the votes in right now compared to the number of people we have in there, but if we can get to 30, we'll be in good shape here. So once again, gang, let's get you over to responseware.com, separate browser on your cell phone there. Put in the session ID trust, and you'll be able to respond to not only this question, but the other questions that Peter has throughout his presentation. I'll tell you what, Peter, we'll give it about 5 to 10 more seconds, and I think you can go ahead and move forward.
All right, very good. Thank you, Kevin. All right, I'll close out the polling. There we go at 30 responses, so 45% male, 55% female. Very good. Let's go to the next one. Where I work, I am in a 1, leader role, or 2, individual contributor role. So answer 1 or 2. And remember, based on your responses to the first question and the second one, these are typical demographic questions we use, and it helps us split out the data. And when we're working with clients, we're actually using a number of different demographic questions. And we'll even use what are called firmographic questions that help us identify, different functions within a firm, et cetera, et cetera. So we're using the slicing technology to quickly help us get it at the data. All right, I'm going to close out the polling. All right, very good. A nice split there. So if you recall the prior slide, about a 45-50 split between male, female, and here we got 57-43 between leader, individual, contributor. Good, so we'll see some nice shifts in the data. All right, now, first question. I believe that people are basically 1, good, 2, bad, 3, neither. So neither blank sheet of paper. In other words, they become good or bad. Good is obvious and bad is obvious too. So go ahead. Answer what your basic belief is or how you basically view people. Okay, I'll close out the polling in a couple seconds. Everybody in? Very good. All right, so we have 82% good, 6% said bad, 12% neither. So I've done this question probably gotten over 10,000 responses, and normally this is the profile of the responses. In fact, I've done this on Wall Street. Believe it or not, the answers were greater than 90% good, 5% bad, and a fraction, very small fraction, neither. So overall, this is aligned with what I've seen before. Let's go to the next question. We tend to trust various groups at different levels. Which group below do you tend to trust more than the others? So in other words, we tend to trust people in all these groups, but in your experience, which group do you tend to trust the most or more? We'll see how this slices out. Maybe we'll try a quick slice of the data. Okay, I'll close the polling shortly. All right. Well, that's a healthy response there to trust our family more than anyone else. So we got a healthy group here today. I usually look for that kind of response. So probably no need to slice that since it's overwhelmingly in that category. All right, next one. Compared to when I was younger, I tend to trust people today less or more. So answer 1 for less, 2 for more.
Hey, Peter, if I could jump in real quick, we have some late joiners to the webinar here. So once again, we're at responseware.com, session ID trust. So responseware.com and a separate browser menu on your cell phone there. And then put in the session ID trust and you'll be right in the session, be able to join the questions that Peter is posing at this time.
All right, let's close out the polling here. Give it a couple seconds. Thank you. Okay, we tend to trust people less versus more, 82 to 18%. Anyone want to comment? Are you hearing any comments, Kevin, from folks on why they might tend to trust people less versus more?
No comments yet, but I think it's a good question to maybe pose it if folks want to go ahead and use their chat or Q&A to go ahead and tell why maybe they responded this way. Might be a good way to go, but why less or more?
All right, so while you're thinking about that, the common responses usually are that when we're young, we tend to be more idealistic. We tend to respect authority figures. And then as, of course, we get older, experience teaches us that we have to begin to differentiate. So part of people growing up is they learn to differentiate between this and that, and they learn to actually scale the level of trust they give versus kind of black and white, all or nothing type of response. So it's quite normal that we tend to trust people less because we've been burned or we've been betrayed or experienced other setbacks that cause us to realize that our judgment about who to trust and when to trust them needs to improve. So that's just a common thing. So for those of you who have actually trusting more, might have come from more difficult circumstances, or your maturity levels reached a point where you have more of an abundant view. So people are coming at this question from a lot of different angles. There's really no right answer, but experience is a great teacher. Okay, so what is trust? There was a book, very popular book, written, I think 8 years ago by Stephen R. Covey's son, Stephen M. R. Covey, called The Speed of Trust. A few of you may have read it. Interestingly, in the book, Stephen M. R. Covey actually refuses to define trust. He simply says, it's you'll know it when you see it. And so the problem with the book, it was a good read, by the way, but the problem with the book is it actually describes everything before and after trust, but doesn't actually get into the construct around what trust is. So let's dive a little bit into that. And I'll kind of start out with trust being defined by the dictionary, right? So as a noun, the dictionary defines it as a firm belief in the reliability of something, truth, ability, or strength of someone or something. So a comment right out of the dictionary here: I should never have trusted her. Common synonyms: confidence, belief, faith, certainty, assurance, conviction, etc. And then we could go down. It's confidence placed in a person by making that person the nominal owner of property to be used. So in other words, a trust as in a legal construct. And then as a verb, we could use it as believe in the reliability, truth, or ability or strength of something. So the question or the comment again, relations have to be built on trust. But still, that might define trust with other words, but what is the essence of trust? That's still a problem, and that was actually the struggle I had with it, was I was trying to understand this nature of this very important thing called trust. So let's start out with this question. How would you rate yourself with respect to trusting others? So in other words, it's anonymous, so would you say you tend to be too trusting, appropriately trusting, or not trusting enough? Go ahead. 1 for too trusting, 2 for appropriately trusting, 3 for not trusting enough. And again, if you have questions, send them to Kevin, and he'll propose them, and I'll talk as people are responding. Okay, we'll close out the polling here in a second. All right, here we have a bit of a distribution. So let's take a look at the data. So 35% of you said too trusting, 47% appropriately trusting, and not so small minority here of not trusting enough. So let's go up to our, as you know, you can data slice here in Turning Point, and let's just look at the female versus the male. So here's the ladies. So too trusting, appropriately trusting went down, and not trusting enough stayed about even. And if we go to the males, okay, male went way up. Everybody see that? Too trusting and not trusting enough went up. So everybody see that slice? So that's the nice part of Turning Point. And we find this is very interesting when we're doing our training. Now let's go over and look at the difference when it comes to leaders. Now, as you know, in Turning Point, you got to reset it. So I'm going over and clicking View Original Chart. It's going to go back, going to Data Slice, and now we're going to look at the difference between leaders and individual contributors. Here's leader. So leaders, too trusting, very interesting. An individual contributor, appropriately trusting went up, but look at that, not trusting enough. So everybody see that difference? There's individual contributor, and there's leader. Okay, so if you have questions or comments on that as I go along, go ahead, send them off to Kevin, and I'll answer. As we get further into the presentation, I'll start to talk about some of the trust traps that occur with being too trusting and some of the problems with not trusting enough. So here, let me reset the chart. And this data will be available to anybody who's interested. You can reach me at that email address. All right, here we go. Resetting the slide. And let's move on. So here's a scale I like to give folks to think about, a range of trust, okay? On the far left side, you see paranoia, and all the way to the right side, blind trust. Now, commonly when we look at these scales, we tend to think of the center being the optimal point, but when it comes to actually healthy trust, actually the sweet spot is off to the upper right. So we've got this kind of zone where there's high trust, it's healthy trust, it's not blind trust, and we're kind of out of that ambivalence or uncertainty, and we're in that sweet spot. And these sweet spots form depending on who and when and where, all sorts of situational variables that determine why we tend to trust. So, for example, when I get on a plane and where I'm going to select my flights, I will tend to choose the bigger planes over the smaller ones, simply because I know those bigger planes have more experienced pilots. So if I'm going to trust more, I'll choose those 767, 737 pilots over the local regional jets. Now, does that mean I don't trust those regional jets? No, I just trust those pilots less, so I just make that distinction when I'm booking my flights. You may do that same thing for other choices you're making every day as you're driving down the road. Okay, now there's two danger zones, though, to keep in mind. There's blind trust, and we've probably all made this mistake where we trusted somebody without questioning appropriately. And then another very unhealthy state, but one that it's much darker, is when we get kind of paranoid and we don't trust anyone. So if you've ever talked to a soldier or Marine coming back from the war in the Middle East, or had a close relative, two of my kids are service vets, and I know many families with some fine soldiers and Marines and other service members. And when they come back from combat zones, it's very difficult for them to adjust to normal life because they've had to be in an environment where they could only trust a few things, and the rest they had to be very careful or vigilant about. So even though we can survive these periods of high distrust, we can survive them, the reality is it's hard to thrive in those environments. So different roles that we have within the company will have different levels of trust. So for example, and you'll see this on the next slide, when I'm interviewing people that are going to go into chief financial or chief risk officer positions, I'm not looking for somebody who is overly trusting. I'm looking for healthy skepticism. They tend to double check. They'll look for primary source data. They're folks who are really buttoned up, attention to detail, and they know how to go make sure things are for real. On the flip side, sales and marketing folks are optimistic. Frankly, if you've never been in that role, it takes a lot of bravery, a lot of courage to go out there and endure a lot of rejection. And those folks have to have a very optimistic view that if they work their prospecting channel, things will happen. So they tend to go out and trust more. And in fact, when they're qualifying a prospect, they tend to worry less about whether the prospect can pay than whether they can get the sale. And the finance people worry a lot more about whether that person's creditworthy. So this range of trust is what you need on a team. And if you have a high trusting CFO, there's likelihood that a cunning character within your firm can get away with embezzlement, fraud, or some other unethical activity. All right, so we cannot function, though, without trust, at least for a long time. So keep this scale in mind. I already told you about those different positions, and I gave you a couple different examples. But as you're assessing team members, whether you're an individual contributor or a leader, get to know the temperament of the person and how they tend to trust will begin to tell you how you can work with that person. And everybody can move towards that kind of healthy range that I just showed you here, this high trust. But professionals have a certain way that they arrive at this location. I'm going to cover that next. All right, so let's still get back to our definition of trust. In your opinion, what to you is trust? Is it mostly a feeling or a choice? Go ahead and answer. And I'm going to give you my definition of trust that you can begin to apply and think about.
Hey, Peter, this is Kevin here. Do you want to answer a question or two right now while people are responding to this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Peter, a question that came in actually on 3 separate occasions is, are generally speaking leaders more trusting than maybe somebody in a different non-leadership type role?
Yeah, I think it is healthy for leaders to be more trusting because they're inviting people to come in. They're trying to include more people on a team. And to be a leader, you're actually trying to build goodwill. In fact, that's the title of my forthcoming book, The Goodwill Leader. And to extend goodwill means that the leader is often the one to make the first move. So they've got to try more. And leaders also have to endure more. In other words, they're going to endure subtle and small betrayals. They may have to endure more gossip and other things. And the mature leader actually will ignore that stuff, not get sucked into it, and try to build trust through extending that goodwill. So a great question. Yes, a healthy organization has leaders with higher trust. Great question. Okay, so good. We got 40 responses. Let me close the polling. Okay, look at this split here. Isn't this interesting? Kind of almost 50-50. Now let's look at what leaders had to say. Actually, let's go to ladies first, females. Wow, everybody see that shift? Isn't that interesting? For women, it was feeling, and For men, it was 50-50. Everybody see that? Okay, so let's go back. This is women, and this is male. Now, some of the mix of this data might be because we had people come in later. So keep that in mind. Kevin, that might have distorted it if we'd had everybody registered at the same time. All right, so let's go. I'm going to reset that. Let's just show the leader one real quick. And here's the leader role. Okay, slightly up on feeling, and here's the individual contributor role, much higher on feeling. Everybody see that difference? So individual contributor there. Here's leader, more of an even split. So everybody see this feeling. Let's go back to the original chart here. I'm resetting it. For those of you who are familiar with TP, you've got to go up and select that button. And this is actually a part of, I think, the challenge in understanding trust. Now, our feelings, and I'm using feeling not to mean that somebody pinched you and you have a feeling of pain, but I'm using that in the context of emotions. We tend to get a feeling of trust towards somebody because our emotions are kind of a combustion point between our exterior sense faculties of sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell, and our interior sense faculties of memory, intellect, imagination, will, intuition. And so in our definition of trust, what we've discovered is, and this is the key definition I would like you to consider today, is that trust ends up being the extent to which you will surrender your will, and the will is that choice faculty in our character, to another person. Now, I'll give you a couple quick examples. When you walk into a building, you probably don't think about this as often as I do because I'm an engineer by training, is you've surrendered a portion of your choice faculty because you already trust that the engineer who designed that building or the architect and other professionals responsible for that have constructed it in a way that it is safe for you to occupy. Same thing when you get on a plane or a bus or any function or activity you're doing in which you're allowing their choices to impact what you do. So again, I gave you the example of flying. When I get on that plane, I'm surrendering my will to that pilot, and I'm trusting that he's in control. Yet it's our feelings that we have to listen to. You see, it's those emotions that we have to educate so that our will is informed through the intellect. And it gets rather complex, but ultimately what I found was that you have to make a choice to trust. So that decision to trust is what really actually helps us to build authentic trust in the workplace, sustain it, and grow it. So again, the definition I'm asking you to consider is that trust is the extent to which we'll surrender our will to another. And of course, you can probably see the tie-in then to goodwill. All right, let's move along. And Kevin, interrupt me if there's any other questions like the prior one. That was great. All right, so here, go ahead, Kevin.
Peter, maybe one more that's in the context of that right there. And this one, it actually came in just as you were speaking about that. So what's the best way, in your opinion, to go ahead and rebuild trust with a superior once that trust has been broken? So I suppose in that context, rebuild trust with somebody who perhaps you report to.
Yeah, that's, and of course it depends on how the trust was broken. In my experience as an executive coach, the leader has broken trust by not keeping their word, and the employee either feels betrayed or some ambivalence about trusting that leader because he didn't do what he or she said they would do. That's commonly what I see. The best way to answer that question is look at this 4-part model I'm offering to you all to consider. The 4 areas of trust between leaders and followers, right? First, you've got to extend trust. So that's kind of the decision to actually choose to trust. And then you got to build it, and you build that through repetition and having your behaviors aligned to your choices and words. And then you sustain it through more and more reinforcement. That's why people develop a reputation that they can be trusted. But finally, the question that Kevin, you just relayed to me by one of our participants is how do you rebuild trust or restore trust? So I would tell you, if you're the one who's broken the trust, then that requires an authentic apology. And in the addendum, if I can get to that, Kevin, after we go through the presentation, or the participant wants me to send them a little tools for trust we have, you can, I think you can go online. I'll send a link, though. I have an article online on how to restore trust through an authentic apology. But if somebody has wounded you or committed a moral injury against you by breaking your trust, I will tell you, many leaders are not as aware that they've broken your trust as you may think. Now, I'll give you a quick example. When I was a plant manager, I've run 3 production plants in my career, and then I've ended up running multiple plants before I made it up into C-level. I remember being out on the factory floor. I was always very much on the factory floor, and employee asked me a question about an issue that had been troubling her, affecting the quality of our product. We were making Ray-Ban sunglasses, the best sunglasses in the world at the time. And I remember telling her, hey, I'll get back to you on that. That's a great question. And frankly, walked away and promptly forgot that I had made that commitment. Well, 2-3 weeks later, she was rather cold and distant toward me. I didn't think anything of it because I was usually moving around pretty quickly. And another week later, I realized that there was a trend. I had to approach her. She didn't approach me, but I had no idea what I had done wrong. And I would tell you that if the leader's broken trust with you, and you don't sense that he or she is aware of it, approach them and ask to have a one-on-one with them. Map out what has caused you to perceive that the trust has been broken, and give them a chance to respond. I wouldn't try to get into a courtroom scene over evidence with them, but just see if they're receptive. I think healthy leaders are receptive to understanding how they broke trust or where they broke trust. And frankly, leaders are going to make a lot more mistakes than followers in this regard. And frankly, you learn a lot from your failures if you're a good leader. So my encouragement to that participant is to approach the leader and take through the situation or the commitment that was made that caused the trust to be broken. Great question. Thank you. All right. Now, I've given you a 4-part model there of extending trust, building it, maintaining it, and restoring it. Now I'm going to ask you 2 questions. And these relate to that first portion of our trust model, extending trust. And I'm going to ask you 2 questions. First is, all are reasons to trust, intentions, actions, results, and habits, but which is the primary reason upon which you trust others? So this is you trusting others. Now the next question is going to be, what's the primary reason upon which others trust you? Okay? So in other words, how do you think others tend to trust you? And then in this question, how do you tend to trust others? So go ahead and answer, and we'll look at the difference here. And then I'm going to give you a little model that builds off of that extending, building, maintaining, and restoring trust, show you how these tie together. And again, Kevin, if there's any other questions, pop them in as we go through this.
Hey, Peter, I'll tell you what, one more question, and it's alluding to the previous one that you answered. What about the other way around? So what if a follower has broken the trust of a leader? Rather than the leader breaking the trust of a follower, what could be some very proactive and best steps to restore that relationship and trust?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I think it takes moral courage for anyone to come forward and acknowledge that I realize that I failed to keep my word, or I realize that I didn't operate in good faith with you, or whatever. And so I would tell you, the first thing is to go forward and just acknowledge, ask for a one-on-one, and try to acknowledge your understanding of how they perceive you. So in other words, use an I statement. I think I've disappointed you, or I think I've broken your trust, and I would like to speak to you about it. Sometimes the leader will surprise you and say, no, I think you were just learning. But in most cases, if your judgment's correct, he or she will be very receptive to that. And then the first step is just to acknowledge what you did wrong. I think too many folks try to skirt around that and offer rationalizations. There's a lot of self-deception today where people just deceive themselves into what really happened. And the best way to rebuild trust is to demonstrate that you're grounded in reality and you know what you did wrong. And then from there, you can identify ways to earn their trust back. So, and you ask the question, how can I restore trust with you? How can I earn it back? And then you work towards that. So it's really an important step. And in fact, my team, while you guys are answering this question, we have this apology topology framework we're doing right now, where each week we're capturing apologies in the news and we're going to be rating them. So any of you are interested in being raters, it's going to be a great little project we're doing. And our notion is that we're going to restore goodwill to America, one authentic apology at a time. So let it begin with us today, right? All right, let's close out the polling. All right, interesting here. Everybody see this? You trust others by their actions. That's an overwhelming answer there. So we don't need to slice that. Okay, a little bit here for intentions, results, and habits, but 69%. All right, let's go to the next question, which is very similar, but now it's how others tend to trust you. Okay, ready? All right, go ahead. Polls open. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute, I misspoke. Which you trust yourself. Okay, so for example, I usually have a third question in this. Keep it shorter today. The primary reason upon which you trust yourself. In other words, the other day, my daughter's fiance, my future son-in-law, came over on his motorcycle, and he offered to let me ride his motorcycle alone. And I told him I don't trust myself anymore to ride a motorcycle. And he asked me why, and I said, last time I rode was 30 years ago. And so that's an example of I didn't trust myself. So, and why I didn't trust myself, I gave you the reason. But what is the primary reason upon which you tend to trust yourself? In other words, you think you know what you're doing, or you have confidence in yourself. Go ahead and answer that.
Peter, well, everybody's answered that question. I think a pretty good one came into the chat, which is, how do I know if I trust too much or too little? Is there some type of measurement tool or scale in which somebody can go ahead and evaluate themselves?
Boy, that is a great question. I got to tell you, for folks who know themselves to be a bit too trusting, I'm going to offer you a framework here in a few slides that will answer that question. I don't want to give away the answer yet because I want to see how everybody tends to respond. But if you'll hold off in a few slides, we're going to cover that very topic, okay? And so remind me, Kevin, if I don't answer it on point, okay?
Will do, Peter.
All right, so here I'm going to close out the polling. And you can see here, look at this, intentions went up. Everybody see that? It went up from like 13%, almost tripled to 33. Results went up to 42, and habits and actions about the same. So here's the prior data. Here's the prior slide. Actions, and we had a spattering across here. And then the next slide, you can see the shift here. Intentions went up, results stayed up. So these are interesting responses, okay? Here's the way I would suggest you think about it. When we're trusting others, everybody saw that actions, okay? I would tell you actions is critical. And when we're trusting ourselves, we tend to trust ourselves by our intentions. In other words, I meant to do good. So this is the way we tend to trust ourselves, intentions. We tend to trust others, though, mostly by their actions. In other words, we can tell first that their actions fit what we would expect somebody to do. So actions are occurring. So if you look at that four-part model I gave you, and again, I'll distribute these slides to folks who are interested, what we found is that this is the kind of way it goes with trusting ourselves. Is we build it first, we have good intentions, or we think we've got the right direction. Then we build trust through our actions. We sustain it. We're trusting ourselves based on results. And we're restoring trust based on habits of excellence, or what the ancient Greeks called virtue. Okay, that is kind of how we go about it. Trusting others, well, it's a little bit different. We tend to extend our trust, like the polling tended to show, through actions and results, but actions first. We build it through the results we deliver, and then we sustain it because we begin to understand intentions. Now, if you're a leader and you're sick of having to tell people every time what to do, it probably is a signal that your employees don't understand your intent. In other words, they can't act on your intent. And this is important if you're going to have a high-performing, high-trust team, is that you get to the point where there's enough consistency and enough sound principles being practiced that people can act on your intent without even being told what to do. And in fact, on really, really healthy teams, people are self-reporting their shortfalls, their mistakes, and disclosing them so that the leader doesn't even have to discover them. And the leader is tolerating failure in the right way. So the phrase I like to tell folks is fail early, fail often, and fail small, so you don't fail late, once, and big. And those habits, that builds up habits, means that when others break trust with you, then they've got to restore that trust. They got to do restitution. You can call it penance, but they got to prove to you that they're worthy of earning your trust back. And that's just that same loop occurring, okay? So keep that in mind. This is a model I'd ask you to consider, and we found it tends to work in helping you to learn how to extend, build, sustain, and restore trust. Okay, so let's go to the next one here, extending trust, and let's get into that initial decision to trust. Now, I'm going to ask you two questions here. How do you tend to trust others, and how do others tend to trust you at the workplace? So this is the first one. How do you tend to trust others? And one is trust no matter what. 2, trust until proven otherwise. 3, trust but verify. 4, trust only if no other choice. Go ahead and answer. And Kevin, this one, when I get through the second question, I'll answer that last question with you.
Perfect, Peter. Very good.
All right, very good. We got 35 responses. I'll close out the polling. And here we've got very close here. Trust until proven otherwise, 51%. Trust but verify, 46%. And a small group over here, trust no matter what. And let's actually slice this by leaders. Let's just see where the leaders came in. Okay, leaders were trust until proven otherwise. See how high that is, folks? Trust but verify dropped. And here's the individual contributors. Wow, trust but verify went way up. So we got a pretty big gap here. Would you all agree? So let's go to the next question. All right, how do others tend to trust you at your workplace? Same question, but now it's how you experience others tending to trust you. Okay, we'll close out the polling here shortly. Okay, we're up just about where we were before. Let's close it out. Okay, still very high on trust until proven otherwise, trust but verify next, a small group of trust no matter what. So the good news is we don't have any paranoids in the audience today, so all right, that's good. And let's slice the data again by those leaders. See what the leaders had to say. Okay, not much change there. And individual contributors, about the same. So we're pretty much lockstep here when it comes to how you perceive others tending to trust you. Okay, we're going to reset that. And then just to refresh your memory, I'm going to go back one slide. And this was your answer. But remember, the leaders were much higher on trust until proven otherwise. And trust but verify was much lower. Everybody see that? All right. So, Kevin, to answer the question, would you restate the question for folks just so we make sure everybody understands the last question?
Yeah, sure will, Peter. So absolutely. So, Peter, how does somebody know if they trust too much or too little?
Yeah, so I would tell you what we've discovered is the problem in our professional and leadership ranks is that we tend to trust too much because we don't go through enough verification loops to actually verify that what we're being told is what we understand to be true or false or something different. So the best way, if you're too trusting, is to begin to develop much more healthy trust but verify loops. In fact, the best teams are constantly checking each other in a healthy way, not in a caustic or jaundiced or jaded way, but just double checking. So, a healthy carpenter, for example, a master carpenter, if you watch them, they have an old rule: measure twice, cut once. Why do they measure twice? They're verifying their senses. They're verifying that they measured 18 inches on that board with their exterior sense faculty of the sight or the eye. And once they verify it, they know they can trust that they got the right measure, then they take action. That's an example of a simple trust but verify loop. But in communications and in leadership in particular, leaders need to have various ways of building trust, and we tend to trust until proven otherwise because we think we're offending the listener or the follower by actually checking or verifying. But the reality is that trust until proven otherwise is nothing more than delayed verification. And so if you think about fail early, fail small, fail often, those small verification loops that allow us to catch errors early create healthy opportunities for education. So when I'm coaching leaders and professionals or factory teams or sales teams, I'm trying to get them to move from trust until proven otherwise much more towards trust but verify to a variety of healthy mechanisms. And so if you're too trusting, think about a variety of ways that you can trust but verify. Last comment, we'll move on to some of the tools for this, is doctors used to call for second opinions. In fact, they used to have the time to call up a colleague and say, hey, this is what I saw in the patient, this is what I'm observing, and here's what I'm about to prescribe. What do you think? And today, we really don't have enough of that kind of professional aptitude of trust but verify. We don't go to our colleagues as often as we should and say, hey, take a look at this email before I send it, or what would you do differently? Those are the kind of things that can help us improve. A person who's too trusting can begin to realize if the more they trust but verify, they can improve that capacity to have healthier trust. Okay. All righty. Kevin, did I answer that, do you think?
Yeah, I think you did a great job, Peter. Definitely. I think that was right on point.
And if you're too trusting, and you're wondering if you're too trusting, you're probably going to get burned at some point, or you're probably going to get disappointed that your expectations weren't met based on what you perceive to be the understanding. All right, so how should I tend to trust others? I kind of went through that. And again, the approach I advocate is this third way, trust but verify. Some of you may, if you're of my generation, you'll remember Ronald Reagan. He used to invoke this phrase when he was negotiating with former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in the 80s. Reagan was actually quoting a Russian proverb. It used to annoy Gorbachev, but Reagan was saying, if we're going to build real trust between us, we got to keep verifying until we have confidence. And so that was more, of course, we were coming from the Cold War, but it was an example of Reagan really having the right aptitude and attitude about the nature of trust. It's also going to improve integrity of whatever you're working with, people, an object, a thing. You're going to begin to find you got the right means at the right time with the right people for the right reasons. That's the nuances around the judgment you'll form as you build up your trust but verify. It actually will improve your ability to differentiate among people too. I can trust my kids when we're out doing this, but I don't necessarily trust them when we're doing this. So if you've ever had a teenage daughter or son say, you don't trust me, they're kind of going black and white. They're undifferentiated when in fact you're trying to make a distinction about what to trust, what situation. So asking questions is really important, and I'm gonna get into that here shortly. All right, so let's let's talk about trust traps here. When you accept the word of your teams, this is really what goes on for leaders. President George W. Bush experienced this with his CIA director, who told him that there were nukes in Iraq, told him it was a slam dunk, and not taking time to explore the complexity of a situation, the likelihood is leaders are going to fall into a trust trap that they'll regret. So how do you get caught in these traps? A variety of ways. And if you've gotten caught in them, don't worry. It's happened to every leader, and you've got to learn from them. Now, doesn't mean, though, we can't learn to avoid those snares. So often they occur because the leader's trying to get along with his team, trying to extend goodwill, but is not making the right judgment. They're not differentiating enough about when to or not to extend trust. And this overextension of trust leads to more fragile states of trust. So we begin to do things to make people feel good even when things are not good. So we've got to learn to ask the right questions. That's critical to avoiding trust traps. So here are 5 tips that I would tell you can help you with this trust but verify approach. And the first one is to learn how to differentiate, seek second opinions, conduct brief backs, establish patterns, and encourage questioning. So I'm going to go into them rather quickly, and again, I'll pass these out for folks who are interested. Under differentiate, this means take an inventory among your team members, get to know them, understand what are differences among them. There's a variety of tools out there. Some folks like to use social styles or DISC or other tools. All those tools do is you learn about the differences in your people, and you'll learn about different ways that will build trust with them. Trust ought to be differentiated based on each member's maturity and their qualifications and performance. If you're working with young, unseasoned people, it's not a good idea to extend trust to them on things that they don't know what they're doing. So much more frequent contact. You have to differentiate, especially as a leader or a professional, based on who you're dealing with and what they know and what they've proven they can do. It's foolish to extend trust to new or untested employees. In fact, when I go into factories, in priority thinking, we promote a series of priority sequences, and we look for leaders who understand those sequences. So, for example, safety being a priority over quality. If we got employees on the floor who have not been trained because the operator assumes that they've got common sense in unfamiliar scenario, then we're extending trust in the wrong way, and we're only going to break it, especially when people are injured or for quality results. And then when you're dealing with qualified and experienced people, they're more worthy of trust. So the leader's going to verify things in a different way. They're going to debate to understand what the person's thinking. In fact, the genius of Steve Jobs was he was always interested in understanding. He was the founder of Apple, by the way. He was always interested in understanding how people thought, and based on how they thought, determined how he trusted. So I think that's interesting when you study leaders. These various things you learn about how they were so successful. All right, so that's differentiate. Now, next one, second opinions. I always look for opportunities to validate or improve the quality of my own judgment. So if you're a leader or a professional, open yourself up to second opinions. Ask folks, hey, what would you do? Doesn't mean you need to agree, but you're looking for other insights, and those other insights are ways that you're actually employing a trust but verify, especially when you're involved in complex problem solving. And for those of you who are trained in Lean, Six Sigma, or Agile methods or other complex methods, it's essential for you to engage in those kind of dialogues. Too many teams stop at the first right answer. And it's much more important to understand that there's more than one right answer, because that'll improve overall performance and excellence. All right, the next one, conduct brief backs. This is really important. I'll tell you, when I was a young infantry lieutenant, I served as in both mechanized and paratrooper outfits. The first thing they taught us as literally a dumb second lieutenant was, when you give out that mission order, ask your soldiers to tell you what you just told them. And I was always amazed at how I got much different answers back than what I thought I was saying. In fact, what I learned was that I was a poor communicator and that I had to get better and better at saying things so that they were understood in the right words, in the right tone, etc. So I often coach leaders that when they're talking to their team, stop and say, "Hey, Sally, what's your understanding of my comments? You know, what resonated with you?" In other words, find ways that are non-threatening to invite feedback, and those are forms of brief back inspections. Okay, I had a CEO on Wall Street who was frustrated that her team was not getting her vision. She had repeated it frequently and often. So the next session she went into, I said, just ask them to tell you what they think the vision is. And she had a great style about her, but she came back to me after that session and said, wow, they were so far off what I wanted that I realized that as good a communicator as I thought I was, I realized I got a lot more work to do. So for leaders in particular, this is a constant challenge to improve your ability to communicate. And you'll avoid a lot of mistakes, frankly, in misunderstood communications. All righty. Let's see here. We'll go back. And next one, establish patterns. Trust but verify is not gotcha management. Okay, it doesn't mean you're catching people doing things wrong. Actually, if you do catch them doing things wrong, use it to be a good educator. But ambush techniques will only diminish your ability to really build authentic trust. Use the verification as an engagement opportunity, okay, versus kind of an inspection or catching people doing things wrong. The best verify approaches incorporate self-correcting mechanisms. So you kind of avoid public shame. So the coaching I try to do is praise in public, criticize in private. And in front of my own teams, I used to publicly acknowledge when I made a mistake. And as the maturity of the team went up, you would see members stepping forward and saying, "Hey, team, I got to tell you about something I did wrong. And we all got to learn from this." So the more mature the team, the less you got to worry about hurting people's feelings. They become tough. In fact, this is a toughening of the soul process. Now, I'll give you a quick story around this. President Obama's first Medal of Honor recipient was Sergeant First Class Jared Monty. And he's actually on the cover of my forthcoming book. He's one of several figures. I interviewed his team that was with him when he died in combat, very courageous young man. And one of the sergeants told a story of what the Army does as a technique called an after-action review. And he talked about how the soldiers were reluctant to admit their mistakes after a particular battle because they might not have fired their weapons correctly, or they might have done all sorts of things that they were ashamed of that were different than what they were trained. He told me that was the hardest thing, was to get people to talk. And, he was a really, really inspiring sergeant. He was there when his best friend died, and it was just a great example. All right, we're almost out of time. I want to get to the next, the last one for you all to think about, which is encouraging questions. Trust always takes two. So invite your team to question your understanding of their work. So, for example, when I was a plant manager, I would issue this memo that said, teach the boss a lesson, and I'd get out there and the employees would teach me their operations. And I had some pretty big plants, as many as a couple thousand, so it would take me months to get through all the operations. But I would have them give me a quiz at the end of my learning session, and they had a lot of fun doing it, made them the teacher. So if you're a leader or a professional, use that technique too, to encourage questioning, and that'll open up and improve your ability to trust but verify. All right, so that takes you kind of through those 5 steps. I'd like to end with any questions, and I'll just, while you're gathering those questions, Kevin, just think about these takeaways from today. The extent to which you trust or do not trust affects greatly the extent to which we survive, depending on the situation, and thrive. In other words, seeking real happiness in our lives. 2, ultimately, trust is going to occur in the choice faculty of our character. Now, listen to your intuition. Educate your emotions, but ultimately your decision to trust is occurring in the will, that choice faculty of our character. Trust is going to always involve some risk. So if you're looking for certainty, you're going to probably be a low trust individual. Trust but verify is the primary way that I encourage, and I'm suggesting to you all to consider, that professionals and leaders cultivate real open-mindedness, real mature and professional dialogue. Avoid those trust traps. I just went through them. And use differentiating, second opinions, briefbacks, routine verifications, and encourage questions. And then finally, restoring trust requires authentic apologies. Take accountability for what you did wrong. Avoid those false apologies of "I'm sorry you feel that way" or "I made a mistake" versus "I did something wrong." All right, with that, I want to thank you all for your time today. My email address is pdemarco@prioritythinking.com. If you want a copy of the presentation today, send me a request, or if you have any other questions. And if you don't mind, while you're entertaining last questions, tell me how I did today. I'm always looking for feedback. Try to practice what I preach. Kevin, thank you again for allowing me this opportunity to present, and thank you to all the participants online.
Peter, thank you very much as well. Fantastic presentation, as always. We thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, today's session was recorded, so we will be sending out a copy of the recording. And then, Peter, if you don't mind, some of the links you were referring to, we can go ahead and throw that in the same email as the recording and shoot that out to everybody at the same time. So thanks again, everybody. And like I said, we'll be following back up with you in about 24 hours or so. And Peter, per usual, what an honor to have you on our sessions, and hopefully we can have you again real soon.
Thank you.